Dealing and working with data is the main thing that we do as developers. And that's the reason why, since the beginning of the course, we have been working with JavaScript's built-in data structures like arrays and objects. Then in the last few lectures, we learned about two new data structures, which are sets and objects. So now we have four data structures from which we can choose. And so I decided to create this quick lecture, which will show you the pros and cons of each data structure and also when to choose each of them. And I want to start this video by quickly categorizing where data can actually come from. So there are essentially three sources of data. First, the data can be written within the program's source code itself, like status messages that will be displayed on a web page based on user actions. Second, data can come from the user interface, so from the web page. It can either be data that the user inputs into some form, or data that's already written somehow in the DOM. For example, this can be the user's tasks in a to-do app, or expenses in a budget app, or anything like that. Finally, data can come from external sources, which is usually a web API. Now, what is a web API? Well, API stands for Application Programming Interface, and we can basically use a web API to get data from other web applications. For example, we can use a web API to get the current weather in any city, or data about movies, or currency conversion rates, and really every kind of data that you can imagine. And we will learn how all that works later in the course. So no matter where the data comes from and what kind of data it is, we usually always have collections of data that we then need to store somewhere. And so where do we store collections of data? That's right, we use data structures. But as you know, there are four built-in data structures in JavaScript. And so now we need a way of deciding between them. But it's not that hard. So the first decision is this. Do we just need a simple list of values? If so, then we're going to use an array or a set. But on the other hand, if we need key value pairs, then we need an object or a map. So the big difference here is that with a key value pair, we have a way of describing the values, so by using the key. On the other hand, in a list, like an array or a set, we simply have the values without any description. Okay? Now, as a quick example, let's go back to getting data from a web API, because in modern JavaScript applications, that's usually the most common source of data. So data from web APIs usually comes in a special data format called JSON, which looks like this example here. So JSON is essentially just text, so a long string, but it can easily be converted to JavaScript objects because it uses the same formatting as JavaScript objects and arrays. So here we have three objects that describe recipes. We have the values in green, like the title and the publisher, and it makes complete sense that these values are then described using a key. Otherwise, we would have no idea what the different values actually are, right? So key value pairs are essential here, and that's why this data is stored in an object, not an array. Now, each of these recipe objects in itself can be seen as a value, and since we have many of them, it means that we have again a collection of data, and therefore we need a data structure to store them. Now, do we want to describe each of the objects? Well, it's not really necessary, is it? We already know they are all recipes, and whatever information we need about the recipes is already stored right in each of the objects. So all we want is basically a simple list where all the recipes are held together. And so here, an array is the perfect data structure for that. And in fact, creating an array of objects is extremely common in JavaScript. Now you will be working with this kind of data all the time as a professional JavaScript developer, and that's why I'm placing so much focus on this here. Okay, now before we move on to compare arrays, sets, objects, and maps, I quickly want to mention that there are also weak sets and weak maps data structures in JavaScript. Also, there are even more data structures that are used in programming, but which are not built into JavaScript. And just to mention a few, these can be stacks, queues, linked lists, trees, or hash tables. And these don't really matter for now, but I still just wanted to let you know that there are more than just the 4 built-in data structures. But now let's talk a bit more about the built-in data structures. So you already know at this point how to use all of them, but it's important to know when to use them. So starting with arrays versus sets, we already know that we should use them for simple lists of values when we do not need to describe the values. Now, you should use arrays whenever you need to store values in order and when these values might contain duplicates. Also, you should always use arrays when you need to manipulate data, because there are a ton of useful array methods. Now, sets, on the other hand, should only be used when you are working with unique values. Besides that, you can also use sets in situations when high performance is really important, because operations like searching for an item or deleting an item from a set can be up to 10 times faster in sets than in arrays. Now, one great use case for sets is to remove duplicate values from an array, like we already did before. So sets are really not meant to replace arrays, but rather to complement them whenever we are dealing with unique values. Okay, so now let's talk about objects versus maps, and we already know that we should use these key value data structures whenever we need to describe the values using keys, right? But when to use objects and when to use maps? Well, objects have been the traditional key value data structure simply because we didn't have maps before ES6. But using objects simply as key value stores has a couple of technical disadvantages, and that's why some people say that we've been abusing objects for this. Now, maps, on the other hand, are way better suited for simple key value stores, because they offer better performance, in fact. Also, map keys can have any data type, and they are also easy to iterate, and it's easy to compute the size of a map. However, the biggest advantage of objects is probably how easy it is to write them and to access data by simply using the dot or the brackets operator. Also, most developers are already super used to objects, and so they simply keep using them for simple key value stores. Anyway, as a conclusion, you should use maps when you simply need to map keys to values, and also when you need keys that are not strings, because as we saw in the last video, that can be very powerful sometimes. Now, if you need functions as values, then you should absolutely use an object for that. So in objects, these functions are then called methods, and you can use the this keyword to access properties of the same object, which is impossible in maps. Also, when working with JSON data, as we saw in the previous slide, you will probably be using objects for that as well, unless you then want to convert the objects to maps. But that's usually not something that we do. So, in fact, we still use objects all the time, but maps are also a very important data structure right now, and way more important than sets. Great, and with that, we wrap up this overview. I hope you found this useful, and so let's now move on.